Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today I would like to talk about description. This is the final part really of our narrative unit. This is the final thing that we need to learn before we can get started on our own descriptive narratives. And hopefully you guys know by now that the narrative is our first major essay assignment, and we are going to be spending pretty much all of next week working on it. So in week 5, there will be no new material. We are simply working on all of the different stages of the writing process. So I went through those stages last week. I won't repeat all of that here, but we're going to return to some of that in week 5 as we go through pre-writing. We're going to do outlines, and then later we move on to drafting. We're going to produce rough drafts, and then of course we're going to end up with final drafts by the end of week 5. So just make sure to keep that in mind. But remember, these are descriptive narratives. So up until now, we've really just been focusing on the narrative part. This week, we need to focus a little bit more on description. What it is, how it works, and how we can sharpen our own descriptive writing. So much like narration, description is a type of writing that most of us are pretty much already familiar with. I don't really need to explain that much about what it is to you guys because you already understand. We can describe all number of things. We use description commonly in everyday speech, just like we use narrative in everyday speech. It's very common for humans. And description shows up in virtually all types of writing. So as we've already said, description relies very heavily on imagery, and we've talked about imagery. Any language that engages our 5 senses. And we often think about sight, but remember those other senses as well. So description relies on imagery, but it also it relies on strong word choice. You need to pick out strong verbs, vivid adjectives. And at times you might even want some sort of expressive adverbs. And we're going to go through all of those different categories here in a moment, but you need to pay attention to the words that you're using. You're also going to use some figurative language. But more than anything, you need to provide concrete, specific details of whatever it is that you are describing. So we can describe people, we can describe places, we can describe objects, we can describe, animals, we can describe virtually anything that we see or experience in the world. So the options are pretty limitless. But as you guys start working on your own narratives, you need to make decisions about the things that you're going to describe. You need to make decisions about how you're going to describe them, and also how much space and time you want to devote to your descriptions. Because these are obviously an important part of writing narratives, or really writing anything at all, but you have to pick your spots. You have to decide which are the most important things to describe, and you need to make sure that you're describing them effectively. So I just want to go through some of the terms and concepts that I posted in the week 4 overview. You already have definitions for these, but I just want to add a little bit more. And then I wanted to just kind of walk us through a few examples of what I'm talking about when it comes to vivid adjectives, strong verbs, and expressive adverbs. I've put in a few examples into the module, but sometimes it helps to kind of talk through a sentence as opposed to just reading it silently, passively by yourself. So we'll kind of get to all of that today, but I'll keep this lecture pretty short. I don't have quite as much content as I've had the last couple of weeks. Back in week 3, we had a 2-part lecture, so I'll try to take mercy on you guys and keep this lecture shorter. So I want to start with the basic distinction between objective descriptions and subjective descriptions. So I've already explained this in the module, and the words probably tell us everything that we need to know. Just remember that an objective description strives to be neutral. So this is the sort of description that a journalist might provide. The main goal here is accuracy, precision, simply getting everything right. So you're going to find these kinds of descriptions in newspapers, but also in academic writing. And we're going to actually see a little bit of this at the end of the semester when we start doing research for our argumentative essay. But when you read academic journals or academic websites that are sort of geared towards advanced students and professors, experts in the field, you'll see some objective descriptions there as well, particularly in like science journals, because obviously they are striving for accuracy and precision. And with an objective description, there's not a lot of room for personal opinion or a whole lot of sort of fancy language, right? It's just about capturing the facts, capturing the most important information, and presenting it clearly and accurately. You might also see these in like an encyclopedia. Right? But in any kind of news reporting, oftentimes in academic journals or in reference books, you're going to find objective descriptions. And we might even make a little bit of use of these ourselves. But typically when we write, especially when we write narratives, which is kind of a creative genre or type of writing, we are going to rely a little bit more on subjective descriptions. These are descriptions that are sort of influenced by emotion, and they are very much influenced and shaped by the mind and the feelings of the writer. So with subjective descriptions, we're still trying to present things as they appeared or as we experienced them, but there's a lot more decision making here. There's a lot more sort of personal choice. There's a lot more personal expression. So as the writer, you have to decide which descriptive details of this person or this object, which ones are you going to emphasize the most? And also your personal opinions and feelings about a person or a place or an object will often influence the way that you describe them. So if you're describing a place that you love, your childhood home, or maybe a favorite vacation spot, you're going to use a lot of language with positive connotations. If you remember last week's lecture, you're going to use some really good sort of positive images. You're going to use words and images and sentences that generally make us feel good and sort of capture the positive feelings that you have about this place. But if you're describing a miserable place or a person who's like the villain or an unlikable character in the narrative, you're going to use a different kind of language. You're going to emphasize different kinds of details because you're trying to express a different impression, a different subjective experience. Oh, I like this place, but I don't like that guy. So those feelings are going to impact how you, the author, describe those things. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong. I mean, this is normal, especially with fiction, especially with creative nonfiction, and many different types of narrative, including most of our own, will feature a lot of subjective descriptions. And again, you're sort of capturing your own state of mind or your own attitude and feelings towards the things that you are describing in your writing. But no matter what, whether you're doing objective or subjective, ultimately one of your big goals with description is to convey or deliver what we call a dominant impression. And maybe you guys have heard this term before, maybe you've learned it in a previous class, but you can think of the dominant impression as sort of like the theme of an individual description. So just like the theme is like the overall point, or the sort of larger message, the overall meaning, that's kind of what a dominant impression is for a description. The dominant impression is the overall, like the most important, most significant impression that we want to leave our reader with. So this is how we want our reader to look at this thing. This is how we want the reader to, feel about this thing. We're trying to express that through our description. So again, if you want to describe an island getaway as this beautiful paradise that you love very much, then the dominant impression that you're trying to express is basically that. This is great. This is a great place. You, reader, should go there. Take your next vacation there. You're going to try to convey a very positive, uplifting, dominant impression. You're going to emphasize all the good qualities, maybe the natural beauty, the luxury of the resorts, whatever. You have to pick the details that are going to entice readers the most, the details that are going to make people feel as good about this place as you feel. So you're trying to convey that dominant impression, and that's what influences the choices you make, the words you choose, the descriptions that you write. But like I said, if you're describing something that you have negative feelings about, and you want your reader to also share those negative feelings with you, then that's the dominant impression. You want, if you're describing a haunted castle, you want decay and fear, and mental illness or whatever. If this is like a Edgar Allan Poe short story, you want to convey that dominant impression, right? Foreboding, mystery, fear, danger. And you can do that through the way that you describe the castle, by fixating on all the gloomy aspects, by fixating on the darkness of the night, the bats, the whatever else is around that contributes to that overall impression that you want your reader to understand. So descriptions generally will deliver some kind of a dominant impression, and you need, as the writer, you need to have that dominant impression in mind, because again, that's going to drive the decisions you make when it comes to your descriptive language. So we obviously want lots of good descriptive details. And you have to ask yourself, what do I need to include? What do I need to mention or explain? What images do I need to draw in order for my readers to get the dominant impression that I want them to get? So if you're describing a person, you might want to really focus on the physical characteristics that you're going to be describing, that you're going to be discussing. If I want people to really see this person, what are the most important features? What are the most important physical qualities of this person that I need to describe? And again, it might depend on how you want your audiences to perceive this person. But you need to focus on maybe the height, maybe the face, maybe certain other parts of the body, because you probably won't be able to cover everything. That's what can be a challenge with description. We want to be thorough. We want to offer a lot of details, but we can't offer every detail. Otherwise, we would never get to the end of our narrative. So we have to be somewhat selective. We have to choose the best details or the most important qualities or characteristics to describe. And we might have to leave some other ones out. And this is true no matter what you're describing. So if you're describing a scene, like an outdoor scene, like some of those videos that I posted in the week 4 module, I recommend that you guys look at those. Again, which parts of the scene do you want to emphasize? Which aspects do you want to really get into? Do you really want to talk about and, explain or describe at length? So just like if you watch one of those little tutorials with the guy doing the hand gestures, he's offering some very basic tips for how to get started on a description. And he's outside sort of looking at this river or this lake, and basically his advice, and it's good advice, when you're describing certainly something outside, any kind of outdoor scene, but this could apply to other things as well. Just start listing everything that you see. Let's just get a good list of details. And that's kind of what that guy does. He kind of invites you to notice, trees, sky, the color of the water. Let's just take an inventory of everything that's around us. Okay, and not all of those details are necessarily going to make it into your narrative. But a good way to approach this is to just write down a lot of the things that you see. There's a tree, I see another tree, I see a rock, the sky is overcast, the ocean is gray. Let's just get a list of all of our details, and then we can start making decisions. We can start looking at all of those details and deciding which ones we need to include and which ones might be a little bit less important. Once we get to the fifth tree, we might decide, okay, we're good on trees. We've said enough about the trees. I don't need these details about the other tree and the other tree and that last tree. Instead, we're going to just talk about the first tree, and then we're going to talk about the water. We're going to talk about the sky, and then maybe you find a few other things that you want to focus on. That's how we get organized. You need to organize your descriptions just like you would organize anything else. And if you're not careful, sometimes descriptions can kind of get away from you. Even if they're good and they have good details or good imagery, sometimes there might be too much. Sometimes your readers might get lost in it, or you might just have unnecessary details that kind of take us away from what's really important. So you do need to get organized. Start going through those details and deciding which ones fit into that dominant impression that you are trying to deliver to your readers. And this is, often kind of part of pre-writing. You can do a lot of this work before you actually sit down to write the narrative. You need to have an idea of some of the most important things that you're going to describe. So if you know that you're going to have a very important scene play out on the banks of a river, and you don't know exactly what's going to happen in that scene, but you know where it's going to take place, then let's start describing that river, even before you sit down to draft. A good thing to have, at least in part, one of the things you can have in your outline could be some of the descriptions that you're going to provide. At least a little annotation or a note about some of the descriptions that you plan to provide, because that is part of planning the overall narrative. So, as I mentioned, there are a few different strategies that you can use when you are organizing your descriptive details. These are kind of optional. We don't always need to use these, but sometimes they do come in handy. So, oftentimes a spatial pattern can come in handy if we're describing stuff like I was just talking about. Like if you're doing an outdoor scene or if you're walking in a city, like some of these settings kind of require clear spatial relationships to be explained by the reader. Even if we're just outside on a river, we kind of want to know, the readers want to know, like where the trees are in relation to the river, right? How big is the river? How wide is the river? What does the bank look like? How much distance might be between banks? I mean, some basic spatial relationships are good to include in your description. You don't have to tell us everything. You don't have to tell us where everything is located. But give us a sense of some of the more prominent items in that scene and where they're located in relation to one another. So when you're describing your detail, or when you're organizing your details, you can move kind of almost as if you're in motion, or you can almost describe it like you're turning your head. The first thing I see is this. Next to it is this. On the other side is this. Or sometimes I imagine like walking or riding a bus like through a city, and the way you might describe things would be very spatial. Like, oh, here's one building, and then we turned a corner, we took a left, and we saw this thing, and then we saw this other thing, and then we turned it again. It's going to be a lot of spatial relationships there in that type of a description. But if you're describing, let's say, a person, you're probably not going to need as many spatial relationships unless you want us to understand where that person is in relation to another person. Maybe their locations matter. Like if it's an action movie, like is this guy falling off the building? Is this other guy fighting? Like you might do that. But if you're just describing a person's appearance, you might use what we call an emphatic sort of organizational pattern where you organize the details based on importance. Like you might just sort of lead with the most important characteristics or qualities. And then you also have a chronological sort of pattern that you can use, moving from start to finish, first to last. So this could work if you were describing like an entire day, like a day in your life. I got up in the morning and this is what I saw, this is what I did. Then I went to work, this is what I saw, this is what I heard, this is what I did, and then I came home at night. You know, you could use a chronological order to help put all those details in place, but it really just depends on what you're describing. You don't have to use any of those three methods if you have kind of your own way of organizing your descriptive details. Just make sure they are organized. And one thing that will help you do this is using what we call signal words, or in some cases, signal phrases. So I've listed a few of these in the week 4 overview. These are just simple words that help to kind of clue in the readers about spatial relationships or the passage of time. So these are words like first, next, then, or words like alongside, nearby, on the other side, first, later, worst of all, best of all. These are words and phrases that help sort of organize based on importance or emphatic, but they also help us to understand where things are located in space and, like I said, the passage of time. First, this happened, and then you might start a later sentence by saying next or later, finally, right? Sometimes these words just help readers to follow your plot. They help readers to follow your descriptions. So we understand, kind of how things are progressing. So words and phrases like that, often at the beginnings of sentences, will do a lot to help you stay organized as you describe things. Okay, so that's most of what I have in my overview. I will talk about point of view a little bit, but first, let's just cover language for a while. Since we did talk about language and close reading last week, hopefully some of those ideas are fresh in our minds. So remember, we're still focusing on imagery and figurative language, two concepts that we learned about last week as sort of important parts of close reading. And yeah, they are, but they're also important parts of description. So oftentimes you might want to use those types of language to help you describe things. If you look back on those narrative poems that we read, that I posted them for you guys last week, Out, and Metaphors, those are poems, but they're still telling stories, and you'll notice how they use imagery to capture the way things look, and in the case of Out, even how things smell or how things sound. So certainly imagery is an important tool when we're describing things. But I also just wanted to talk a little bit about verbs and adjectives and maybe even adverbs, because we all know what these are and we know what they do and how to use them and all of those basics, but we don't always spend a lot of time thinking about our choices when it comes to words like these. So I just wanted to give you a few examples, right? So when I say vivid adjectives, like what does the word vivid mean? It just means to leave a strong feeling or to produce a really clear image. And that's exactly what we want to do with our descriptive language. So when you're using adjectives, when you're using words that describe other things, put a little bit of thought into your choice. Instead of just saying that something was loud, perhaps you want to say it was deafening. Sometimes a stronger adjective will capture a much stronger feeling. It will deliver a much more vivid image or impression, especially if you really want to emphasize something. So instead of loud, maybe deafening. Instead of, it was painful or it hurt, maybe it was excruciating. right? So these are just ways to kind of strengthen our language and just deliver a stronger impression instead of sort of weak descriptors like good, bad, hurt, slow, fast, big, small. I mean, those are fine for certain kinds of writing. For writing that's not really designed to be imaginative or entertaining. But remember, with a narrative, we're telling a story, we're trying to entertain an audience. So that's going to matter when it comes to choosing words. And it's the same with verbs, right? I mean, you always have a choice. You can go with the simple, you can go with the basic, or you can go with something more expressive, more powerful, that delivers more of an impact to the reader. So I have an example. I think I have the sentence in the week 4 module of the difference between saying that I walked slowly to class, on the day of the test versus saying that I shuffled to class. So this choice of verb might not really seem to matter, right? But notice that when I say walk slowly, the verb walk is so vague and kind of weak in that sentence that I need a modifier to come right after it. I need to tell you that I'm walking slowly, because walking just by itself, the word walk by itself doesn't tell us much. There are a lot of different ways that people can walk. People can power walk. People can walk slowly. People can walk in a medium tempo. So that's just not a lot of detail. I'm not giving you much specific detail. Walk. Yeah, anybody can walk, and a walk can be almost anything. So I'm not actually delivering a lot of info or detail or really much of an impression. If I tell you that I'm walking slowly, who cares? But if I use a stronger verb, a more interesting verb, a verb that actually carries more meaning, like shuffled, now I'm actually doing something a little more interesting, and I'm saving some time. Because the word shuffled, well, it has multiple meanings, but when somebody is using that term to describe walking, what that usually means is you're sort of dragging your feet, barely picking your feet up from the ground, and yes, you're moving slowly. That's kind of implied. So if I tell you that I was shuffling my way down the hall to the classroom on the day of the test, my verb choice here is actually doing a lot of work. Not only am I giving you the basic info that you need to understand, what I'm doing in the narrative, but also if you pay attention to that verb, the verb gives you some insight into my state of mind. Okay, because there could be any number of reasons I was walking slowly. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was talking to somebody. Maybe I was sore from running yesterday. Maybe I just moved slowly in the morning. We don't know, because nothing in my writing is really explaining it. But if I tell you that I shuffled, and if you know what that word means, you know what it means to be shuffling, to be dragging my feet, moving slowly. Maybe my eyes are cast down on the ground. Now, and we understand where I'm going. I'm not going to a fun place. I'm going to a class to take a test. So now we're beginning to understand, okay, now maybe we know what my mental state is as I go to take this test. If I'm shuffling, I probably don't feel great about the test. I'm probably not feeling confident. I'm in no hurry to get there. I'm stalling. I'm maybe, feeling bad. And that all kind of comes through with the verb. The verb paints a much more vivid image. Now you can see me walking, dragging my feet. And we even know what that term means, right? If you're dragging your feet, you don't want to do what you're about to do. That's obvious now. But it wasn't really obvious before with my weaker verb. When I just said I was walking slowly, who cares? That doesn't make an impression. But shuffling might make an impression, and it delivers more meaning. It says more about what's going on with the character and what's going on at this point in the narrative. So I could go through a lot more examples, right? Instead of saying he ran fast, why not he sprinted? And see, you also notice that we're being more efficient here. Because again, weak verbs need to be modified. Weak verbs need another word to help finish the job because they're not doing it all on their own. Just like walk can be a lot of different things, so can run. So we have to say run fast. That's 2 words. Instead, I can say sprinted. That's 1 word. And I'm accomplishing the same thing, but I'm actually doing a better job because sprinted is more vivid, it's more specific, and it's going to help the reader get a more clear image of what the character is actually doing. So, little things. These are little things, but they do matter. And just a final sentence, I did not put this one in the module, but just listen to the difference. Okay, so on one hand, this sentence is perfectly fine. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just kind of boring. I was very happy as I walked home that night. Okay. I mean, that's clear. It's a complete sentence. I was very happy as I walked home that night. It's fine. But is it memorable? Does it paint a clear image? Can you even really see me at all? I mean, yeah, you know I'm walking. And you know I'm happy, so I guess maybe you imagine me smiling, although people don't typically just walk around smiling. Other people might think that you're strange. So how am I conveying the happiness, really? I'm just telling you that I was happy. Nothing in my language is really describing much in detail. I'm just telling you I was happy and walking home. Okay. We're going to understand that, but we're not going to remember it, and we're not going to care about it that much. But what if I said, I was so happy that I glided home, or I floated home that night? Those stronger verbs deliver more meaning. Because if we look up the word glide or glided, that means that I have an easy, smooth, continuous movement. And it sort of suggests that my feet are not even on the ground. Again, this is kind of figurative language almost, because I didn't literally glide or float. I don't have the ability to suspend myself in midair. Most humans don't. But, you get what I'm saying, right? If I floated home, that conveys my mental state. That's a better way to convey the happiness, right? It's hard to describe happiness, but floating or gliding, those are verbs that clue you, the reader, into the character's mind. Whereas just saying walking home or running fast, those don't do as much work. Those are not as clear. Those are not as specific. So we always want to strive for good, concrete, specific details. And sometimes that means that we just need good verbs. We need a good, vivid adjective. And I mentioned adverbs before. So just remember, an adverb is a word that modifies a verb or a noun or an adjective. Or in some cases, even another adverb. But these are good words to use. Again, sometimes we have to use them if our verbs are weak. But in other times, we can add descriptive adverbs to paint a more complete picture. So instead of just saying sweating, you could say sweating profusely. If you really want to make this a more vivid image and to make it more memorable for your readers. Instead of just he was tapping his pen on the table, perhaps he was impatiently tapping his pen. Again, that descriptor helps us now to understand a little bit more about the character. This character's not just slow, he's unbelievably slow. Now we start to know how the other characters perceive him. They can't believe how slow he is. If we just say he's slow, we're not capturing that detail. We're not delivering that high level of specificity. So just go beyond the obvious, go beyond the elementary when it comes to your descriptions, when it comes to your verbs and your adjectives. Pick strong ones, pick expressive ones, because that is part of being a good descriptive writer. All right, and the final thing I wanted to add here, Oh, yeah. Just point of view. I just wanted to mention this because we've already talked about point of view in relation to our main narrative elements. So I just wanted to go back to this because it has a slightly different meaning when we're just talking about description. So all descriptions will come from a certain point of view or perspective. Normally, it's going to come from the perspective or point of view of the narrator, of course, whether that's a first-person narrator or maybe a third-person omniscient narrator, whatever. But you have to establish sort of a difference between physical relationships and psychological relationships. So sometimes the narrator will take sort of a physical point of view when describing something. This will often be true with like places, like locations, or like a mountain or an ocean or a river, like we were saying earlier. We're going to maybe, when we're describing things like that, we're going to use physical characteristics. We're going to focus on those spatial relationships. So if I'm describing a mountain, like, you as the writer, you embodying that narrator, you have to figure out what is your physical relationship to the thing that you're describing. Like, is this a character in the story giving us this description as the character climbs the mountain? Are we at the bottom of the mountain looking up? Or are we getting this perspective from the top of the mountain after we've already climbed it and we're looking down? See, those physical differences will obviously influence what kind of description you end up writing. So there's always going to be a physical relationship to the thing being described. Like, how close to it are you? Are you seeing it from a distance? Maybe that means you can't describe it in quite as much detail. You can just give an outline. Or maybe it's something right next to you. Just things like that. But that's certainly true with objects and like physical places. But when we talk about psychological point of view, that's a little bit different. I mean, this refers more to the narrator's state of mind, right? How does the narrator feel about the thing being described? So this kind of goes back to what we were saying with subjective descriptions. A lot of them are driven by your personal feelings or attitudes about the things being described. So once again, if you have a negative perception or a negative attitude towards a person or an object or a place, then that's going to influence the details that you choose and the organization of your descriptive details and everything else. So just keep that in mind. You're always going to have sort of a physical relationship to the things you describe, and you'll also have a psychological relationship. And use both of those categories for details. Use both of those categories to help build your descriptions. See, you have plenty to do. You can talk about where things are located spatially. You can also refer to how things are perceived, how things make you feel, how a certain image makes you feel, a certain sound, this body of water, whatever. You have a lot of material to work with between the physical and the psychological. So again, look at my examples in the week 4 overview. I give you guys multiple examples of good descriptive sentences, and I sort of point out some of the important details that I'm providing. And again, just using these good verbs, good adjectives, but also just paying attention to spatial relationships, number, color, all the different senses, all 5 senses, and then also our psychological relationship to the thing being described. So let me know if you have any questions. Take a look at those videos, especially the one with the guy doing the gestures or whatever. That's short, it's easy, and he gives you some good tips to get started. Also, maybe just play along with those little exercise videos where they show, not like literally exercise, but they give you descriptive exercises. They show you a scene. One's like a beach scene, another one's in like a harbor, and they ask you to basically describe everything that you see. So this is that basic strategy that we're starting with. Just list the details. And again, try to tap into senses, tap into as much detail as you can, and then later you can go back and organize those descriptive details and figure out which ones are most important for you. All right, so let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week as we get started on Essay 1.